First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Lovely to see you again. And I need to give you a warning that I'm not using any PowerPoint. So you're not going to have to look at the screen, you can look at me instead. And I'm very flattered and grateful for the opportunity to speak to you. The trouble with universities is that I feel like one of these dogs in the back of a car, sort of like just moving my head backwards and forwards. If I wander around a bit, then forgive me. A little bit about who I am and what I am. My background is professionally as a social worker, which I decided I wanted to be at the age of 11. Wasn't quite sure what a social worker did, but I liked the sound of it. And someone bought me, when I was around about 11, 12, a book. It was partly a children's book, but it was all about social work, and I was actually quite taken with that. So I thought, right, that's what I'm going to become. Never regretted it, ever, except when I became a director of social services, and then I regretted every single day of it. But that's another story. So when I retired from being a director, I was then involved after a period of unwellness with the Cabinet Office, leading a programme called Better Government for Older People, which was really around advising ministers and civil servants around older people's issues, policy, practice. But it always kept an interest in safeguarding, which I'd picked up, as Bridget and certainly Peter knows, back in the early 80s when I was involved in a day centre, an assessment centre, and I came across, one day, one of our clients was refusing to go back home. And we were trying to find out what was that about. And after a period of time, we discovered that she was being cared for by her niece and was being physically abused. So I thought, I've never come across this. Never come across it. In training, never touched. And some of you will be old enough to remember the term granny battering. So A.A. Baker and Burston were the first medics, basically, to be thinking around the abuse of older people. So I thought I'd research this. So in those days, you went to the Centre for Policy on Ageing, who had a major library, none of this internet stuff. You couldn't Google anything. And I said, well, can you just send me the references around granny battering or abuse or whatever? And eventually in the post came 7 sheets of paper. And I thought, wow, 7 sheets of paper is going to be a lot of research. There were just 7 articles that was available. And so I then decided to do some research myself. Out of that grew an interest with PASA, or we co-formed PASA. So my interest in safeguarding is of long standing. I moved from being a director of social services into the world of cooperatives, and I'll say something about that in a minute. So that's my potted biography, yeah? Were you fascinated by that? Yeah? Are you astounded? Excellent. Okay, so let's do some context before we home in on the issue of cooperatives and what cooperatives can and can't do. And we'll check that out with you. Okay, it seems to me in recent years, looking at social care, that there's been a growing importance in the notion and the construct of co-production. And that's increasingly becoming, if you like, popular, but it means different things to different people. What do we mean by cooperation? And certainly in terms of both practitioners and researchers, there's an anxiety around what it actually does it mean, what are the actual outcomes, what are we co-producing. But co-production is an important part of the social care landscape. There's also, alongside that, an increased interest in the notion of citizen-based social work. And again, that's feeding into some of our thinking around social care approaches. And we've got sort of still around the notion of so-called service users being seen as consumers and customers. So those things are playing together in the context of social care, and what we're not quite clear about is what that may or may not mean in terms of safeguarding, but looking at the Care Act, we'll come on to it in a moment, there is this notion around not just co-production, but engagement, empowerment, and so on and so forth. But what's important for me is that social care, certainly post-Thatcher, and I make no political point here, but post-Thatcher, there was an increased move to move social care out of, if you like, the state system into a broader market. And again, some of you will be remembering under the old STG, the Special Transitional Grant, when community care first came onto the landscape, that the underlying, if you like, assumption, certainly at that point by the government, was that things that are in the public sector are badly run, badly managed, ineffective. And if you looked at the, if you like, the private sector, much better. Well managed, yeah, good outcomes, cost effective. So there was this notion that if you were in the public sector, you were wasteful of resources, time, energy, but if you worked in the public sector, in the private sector, you were more focused, more aware of issues around outcome. So we had this move that marketized social care. Now, how do I put this? I'll put this gently because I feel I need to be gentle for the first 10 minutes or so. The notion that older people in particular, and generally, should be subject to market forces, subject to profit, that you actually earn a profit out of care, for some of us we're anxious about that. We're anxious. And the false assumption of the Thatcher years, which let's say was carried over post-Thatcher into the Blair years, the Brown years, the Cameron years, even the coalition years, and now is still the same. And we have a market around social care that is fragmented, that it fundamentally shifted, it could be argued, the very purpose and role and nature of social work, where social work became mainly gatekeepers and signposted, it could be argued. So therefore we had this notion of customers and consumers. There was then this move into personalisation, cash for care, and it started to have a narrative and some policies and some practice that attempted for the so-called service user to have choice, to have some notion of being able to personalise budget and direct payments, the option of choosing their own care. Now let me say that that works in some places and it's been a disaster. In one London borough, people receiving personal budgets are then given a menu of places that they can purchase care from. And in one particular London borough, in inner London, their personal budgets, direct payments, are actually used to fund a local day centre which they have to attend. What? What? It was also believed that through personal budgets and personalisation, an individual and or their family, but the individual had control over the specific services, where they got their services. Absolute nonsense. It's a myth if you look at the broad landscape around social care. Sarah Banks, professor at Durham University, has said, in spite of the rhetoric of personalisation and customer consumer choice, the majority of users of social care services cannot be regarded as consumers or customers. And many have argued that the limitations of choice and the rhetoric of control is basically false. It's not real. And one of the things that have occurred post-Thatcher and carried right through, I would argue, even to today, is that social work and social workers have actually been about rationing scarce resources. And those of us that have lived, you have, I've not lived with it for a number of years now, but those of you that lived with the eligibility criteria, that when pressure was on budgets, you just ratcheted up. So you've got to be bloody half dead before you can actually be eligible for a service. And I remember when I was Director of Social Services, sitting in committee, to my shame, arguing the benefits of eligibility. To my shame. Because we rationed out whole aspects of need. We rationed out individuals who were struggling. We rationed out, you're not eligible. Go to a voluntary sector. Go to age concern in those days. I'm not making any judgment about Age UK at all. So we directed people. And where was prevention? What does prevention mean? So that was the state of play, and it's argued that we assess people for what they can't receive and what they can. Finance is allocated to individuals in the context of an overall budget. And in terms of local authorities over recent years, local authorities have had a 40% cut. A 40% cut. And this notion somehow that welfare is about control, in my view. Am I making sense? Are you warming up? Because I'm warming up now. Yeah? So welfare is about control. And you've got the likes of Peter Beresford in Essex, who I love dearly, not as much as I do Bridget, but I love Peter. Because what Peter does is to try and say, this has got to be about the control of the individual, by the individual. And I'll come on to talk about where, perhaps, the cooperative sector has a role. But what we've also found ourselves over the last decade, perhaps, if not longer, is that the re-emergence of, and a distinction between the deserving and the undeserving. And you move into, if you like, attitudes, and I'm talking about older adults in particular, that you move into narratives for in and around older people, that somehow they fall in the deserving category because they're old. Does that make sense? Yeah? And so you've got these stereotypes about older people's services. So you get Esther Ranson saying to herself, what shall I do? I think I'll create Silverline. And this will address loneliness by a phone call. Now, Betty Friedman, some years ago, died a couple of years ago, and she's a heroine of mine. I love Betty Friedman. You're nodding, you know, don't you? And she wrote The Fountain of Age. What a seminal piece of work. It rooted me. She articulated what I felt, but wasn't bright enough to articulate. And so she used the term compassionate ageism, where we classify older people and we are compassionate. What we are is patronising and paternalistic. That's what we are. That's compassionate ageism. And the third sector, charities and others, feed into that compassionate ageism. It's not good enough. It's not good enough. But there is a move to develop social care, again, around for older people, but social care generally, in terms of looking not just at people being service users, but service users as activists, experts, and allies. CQC, where's my person? Yeah, how are you? How's darling?
Thank you. I'm only about to go down.
Why is that? No, I love CQC, and all this rubbish and thing about regulation and all that sort of, and I love Anglia. You give my regards to Anglia. But the issue is, they developed experts by experience. Yeah? But caution. Caution. Being older or being involved in social care as a relative or user or whatever doesn't necessarily make you right. And one of the problems we have in terms of due regard to the experience and the expert experience is that it can often act as a very narrow prism through which to view need and responses. And I've come across many, many, many who are very much involved through their own experience in social care, but they often still come to it with a narrative that's patronising and paternalistic. Because have you noticed an older person is always somebody else? It's never us. Now, you're going to be surprised by what I'm about to tell you. I am 2 years off of 70. Now, aren't you amazed? No. I love you already. I love you already. I knew what you wanted. No, you've heard this tape before, have you? Okay. But that doesn't make me right. Doesn't make me an expert in anything particularly apart from my own experience. So, where the consumer of welfare services are in fact active members of a group or movement resisting the notion of, and this is important, resisting the notion of victimhood, being victims, victims of living with dementia, victims of loneliness and isolation, and victims of potential abuse. And this notion of victimhood has to be challenged. It has to be challenged in my view. But there's also a resistance to, if you like, needs being defined by professionals. And that's a dangerous one. Because just as an older person, I'm not always right. Being a professional doesn't always make you wrong. It's about how you come together through deliberation, dialogue and relationships that actually start to move us more into co-production, if that's what we want. So what does all this mean in terms of safeguarding? The first question I would say in terms of safeguarding is there a need to think differently about safeguarding? And what does that actually mean, both in terms of the individual, policy and practice? Now we know from the 2014 Care Act that the issue, the 6 principles of safeguarding, you know that. So let's just refresh our memories. Empowerment, protection, prevention, proportionality, partnership and accountability. Making safeguarding personal. A duty to cooperate. A duty to cooperate. And managing and dealing with safeguarding inquiries. So let's look, because that's what I've been asked to do, at what we mean by this duty to cooperate. Morning. Oh, I'm terrible like that. I don't mean to embarrass you, sir.
You haven't.
Good. I've failed then. Nice to see you. Okay. We have to cooperate in terms of the Care Act and safeguarding with the local authorities, the police and CCGs. And we must liaise with and provide assistance and guidance and ensure that we have quick, consistent and a fair process with a whole range of different agencies, both within civic and civil society. And an integral part of the duty to cooperate is the duty to share information. A duty to cooperate with those other agencies in civil and civic society. How's it working? How's it getting on? Has it revolutionised safeguarding from your own experience? No, I don't know. Here, in this county, or your unitary authorities. But some of the evidence is very slow. And you've got some very interesting narratives coming from Calderdale under organisations like the Principal Social Workers Network, who are questioning, with Rob Mitchell and others, this whole notion of safeguarding more in the context of human rights and more in the process of what it is that we're actually trying to safeguard. So, taking a breather, in the context of co-production and personalisation, the social care narrative of crisis, and that's important because the landscape has this shadow over it that talks about a social care crisis. And the social care crisis is often determined on two levels. One is the ageing of the population, and secondly, it's defined in terms of supply and demand and affordability. I would say that the social care crisis is far more than that. Is that social care is defined and understood and experienced as being done too. And therefore that disempowers or jeopardises and compromises the very principles of safeguarding that were outlined in the Act. It could be argued, and I would argue. So I worry about the notion of social care, and everybody's at it. You pick up a paper, you hear a politician, you talk to your neighbours, and there's a sense of care in crisis. And what that does, it undermines social care. And it often undermines the work that's being done. But the market is fragmented and it is failing. And care is, and safeguarding is constructed arguably around price, competition and profit. Now, when I was being interviewed a couple of weeks ago by BBC Radio Essex, just showing off there, the question the journalist said to me is, well, Mervyn, that's all very interesting, because I thought about co-ops. All very interesting. But are you saying that care should return to the state? Well, let me be very, very clear. Yes, I am. Yes, I am. And the other issue that we seem to have lost sight of, I believe, is that the corruption of care can happen almost anywhere. And when I was a director of social service and worked for 30, 40 years in social care in the public sector, I had residential care homes, care services, where there was corruption. So the issue for me was, what did I do about it, and how did we prevent it? What was the response? And what we know from the work on corruption of care, certainly by Wardborough and Wilding, is that often there is a collusion throughout the whole organisation that either denies it or covers it up. Does that make sense? So I want to explore a different model. Now, if I were to say to you, what's a cooperative? Yeah? What's your experience of a co-op? What would you say? Shops? Yeah. Bank? Funeral care? Yeah. When I left the Better Government for Older People and I was starting to re-engage in work and was in BGOT, we were thinking around, I knew nothing about co-ops, apart from funeral care, retail. And our nickname in the cooperative sector, co-ops is more than carrots and coffins. And that was a real eye-opener to me when I got engaged in the co-op, because what we did when we was a quango of government is we spun out to become a cooperative. I'd never crossed my mind that the cooperative actually has a great deal of potential to address the very things that I've been talking about. Marketisation and so on and so forth. Why? In general terms, cooperation is about working together to achieve common aims and doing what is asked and required. Now, the history of social care in the co-op is very, very new. So when we spun out into Change Agents, which is a multi-stakeholder cooperative, and I'll explain a bit about that in a moment, is that we began to think, hang on here, what is it about the principles and the values of the cooperative that can apply and should apply to social care? So my colleague Cheryl Barrett, who had a lifelong history in the co-op and had worked with me in Better Government, we started to say, well, okay, the co-op really are not listening or aware that another area of activity that they could think about becoming engaged is around social care. And a colleague in the co-op nationally, Laurie Gregory, he was an assistant director of social services, but he specialised in children. And he set up a foster care cooperative. And he was on the board of Cooperative UK. And he says to me, Mervyn, I tried for years to get the board to take seriously the notion of social care cooperatives. And that was about 8 years ago. So we made it our mission that we would, by hook or by crook, within the cooperative sector, say that social care is a valid area of service. And then we fell over carrots and coffins. Because carrots and coffins are about retail. It's about selling. And it's also, in many ways, about business. So the cooperative group, where the money is, that's where the money is, the cooperative group, have wadges of money on carrots and coffins. Once. They got a cold with the bank, which has now become a hedge funded bank. But we were saying social care is not a business, it's a service, but a service that should run on business lines. Does that make sense? It's not a service. So when we talk to the group, or we talk to Cooperative UK sometimes, we get this, yeah, I think there is, I know what you're saying, but then they also see it in market terms of selling as a business. And therein lies some dangers around the co-op. But over 7 years, we now have a national cooperatives social care forum, which I chair. If you put me in a group, I'll always try and end up as its chair. Yeah. But we're getting there. We're getting there. The Centre for Health and the Public Interest in November 2016 said, or rather asked, what is to be done about the failure of privatised adult social care in England? What do we mean by privatised? Now the unions, Unite, what's the other one? Unison, Unite, the public sector unions, are very cautious around cooperative social care. And I get it, I understand that. And they're cautious because they see that if local authority managed, run services are actually spun out into a cooperative, for them it's as bad as being spun out to Virgin Care. This is being recorded, isn't it? Yeah. So let me be careful. I would not give Branston anything in terms of social care. Have you got that? Send it to Richard with my love. Okay. The Welsh, when they came to look at their Care Act, and because it's devolved, actually were very clear that they said that they would promote, quote, user-led cooperative social enterprises and third sector organisations. So the Assembly in Wales, in its legislation around social care, specifically named cooperatives as needing to be encouraged. Wonder why that is. Because what do we mean by cooperative? It's not about the broad definition. The cooperative was started in Rochdale by the so-called Rochdale pioneers in 1844. And it was designed and created on the basis that the workers who were producing and distributing were being completely, not just marginalised, but exploited. So they took control of production and of distribution and of selling. So the weavers in Rochdale and the colliers and the wool sorters and the cloggers looked at transforming the world, which they did quietly, into cooperatives. What does that mean? It is where you become a member. So if you're a member of a co-op, you're a customer. You don't need to be a member, but we're a customer. You are engaged in co-owning that cooperative together with the staff. Now that's important. Because what we'd argue is this. The 7 principles of the cooperative internationally and their values. Let's talk about the values first. The values written internationally for all cooperatives are these. Honesty, openness, equality, responsibility, solidarity, and community. They're the values. So everything that's done, either in a service or a business within the cooperative sector, in theory and often in practice, is underpinned by those values. Written down, need to be complied with and evidenced. But it's 7 principles which struck me as being quite interesting. Voluntary and open membership. Democratic member control. Member participation, economic participation. Autonomy and independence. Education, training and information. Cooperation amongst cooperators. And concern for the community. Well, let's tease that out a bit. What do we mean by social care cooperatives? I'll tell you what I mean by it. It's where you change the relationship between the individual who is receiving the service, the staff who are providing that service, and the commissioners that commission that service. And you change the relationship through those 7 principles on the basis that my mum, who is in long-term care, living with dementia, would become a member of that social care cooperative. And therefore she becomes a co-owner of that service. See how polite I am? Not a word. Okay, so mum is not a service user, she's not a client, she's a member owner of the very service that she is experiencing. Owns that service. The staff who have power are also members, but they're co-owners of the same service. So the relationship between the mum and the staff is that they are actually equal. Does that make sense? They own the service, they control the service. And what's important is the staff as owners and the users as owners and the commissioners, still sorting this bit out, is that they also co-govern. They co-govern. They're all responsible within the principles of cooperation and the cooperative. So you have democratic control of the service. I've also added another group. And the group I've added are families. Families need to be co-owners of the service. Does it make sense? So you've got the user, so-called, the member, you've got the staff, you've got the families, where there are families, and families can be defined in broad ways. They're all part of the cooperative, governing the service. Using the values of honesty, transparency, equality, responsibility, solidarity. The service is independent. It is autonomous. So, each regional branch is an autonomous entity within the cooperative. They govern themselves. There is no control from the centre, apart from the values and principles that bind them together. Involved in education and training, cooperate amongst cooperators, and concern for the community. Let me just share with you what sort of resources we're thinking about here. This is in the UK. There are over 7,000 cooperatives in the UK. Not 7,000 places selling carrots or coffins. They are included. 77,000. Cooperatives, those 7,000 cooperatives, contribute to the UK economy each year £34 billion. And the cooperatives are owned in the UK by 17.5 million people. It's big. And if you go worldwide, and certainly in Canada, British Columbia, am I doing for time, Bridget? Am I okay? Yeah. In terms of British Columbia, Canada, northern Italy, some parts of South America, some parts certainly in Asia, the only show in town in terms of social care are cooperatives. Now that's partly to do with history. They didn't have a welfare state as we had since 1948. So the only providers are in fact cooperatives. But what they found is the value of cooperative values and principles and services meant what I've just said. Member ownership, member control, member governance, and member benefit. It's the other issue, member benefit. And that member benefit is benefit for and with the user, the staff, the families, and the community. They all benefit. And we've talked and coined the phrase in change agents, which is getting some purchase around the notion of fair care, taking it from the fair trade experience. Fair care, fair on everybody. None of this low wages, low status stuff in terms of staff. That's important. Okay. So what are the strategic areas and opportunities for social care, particularly in relation to safeguarding? There are a number of pathways. One is about contracting, externalisation, though the unions are against it, partnership, society venture, this is where a new business starts up, or a new start. And stakeholder cooperatives, multi-stakeholder, which I'm arguing for, are in that ballpark. So the characteristics of a cooperative social care approach is it's not for profit. Not for profit. We argue that it's multi-stakeholder, and I've explained that. Danger, health warning in terms of multi-stakeholder. And that's what's called stakeholder capture. This is where one element or cohort of the multi-stakeholders actually capture the organisation. And what I mean by that is sometimes you get the managers, the salaried, who actually capture and control, so that those members, co-owners, like me mum or the family, actually don't get a look in. A, because it's breached the values and principles of cooperation, but it's management capture. Worker rights is another characteristic of a multi-stakeholder and cooperative approach. And this is where we're discussing, and some of you may know this, last few years there's been the Cooperative Innovation Network, and these are local councils who have signed up to cooperative values and principles in terms of its services. And there's 23 at the moment. And these are elected members in local councils who have become members of this innovative council, cooperative councils network, who are attempting to work through and address social care or other services in the context of cooperation. And there's also collaborative commissioning as another approach within the cooperative framework. Okay, if safeguarding is about empowerment, participation, proportionality, protection, partnership, accountability, and if safeguarding is about human rights, justice, non-coercive control, non-coercive practice, but control and intervention and risk, and you place safeguarding within, if you like, the framework of a cooperative service, what would be the impact of that? And I'll be very honest with you, we don't know. Don't know. But I fundamentally believe that if we change the relationship and the power imbalances that exist between users of the service, those that provide the service, those that commission the service or own the service, if we shift it into a relational relationship and context, in terms of safeguarding, it has some very interesting possibilities. Now, a few months ago, I was at the UK Cooperatives Congress in Wakefield. And there's an organisation there, it's a worker-owned social care cooperative. Worker-owned. It's not multi-stakeholder, where the staff actually own the John Lewis of social care. And I was supposed to be on the platform. Unfortunately, I couldn't do that because I was somewhere else, but I got into the tail end of the... And one of the panel members said this: Winterbourne would not have happened had it been a cooperative. What? What? Let me repeat. Winterbourne would not have happened had it been a cooperative. Get out of here. So I put my hand up. I'll put my hand up for anything. So I put my hand up. I said, hey, hang on, let's be cautious about this. The corruption of care can happen anywhere. Secondly, look at the bank. Look at the cooperative bank with the Reverend crystal meth, where the group and the bank had completely lost sight of its values and principles. They had management capture. So they go into this crazy grab of Lloyds, of pharmacists and whatever, and nearly became broke. So don't tell me Winterbourne, which happened to be a hospital, not a social care, don't tell me that it can't happen. And don't, in our in our excitement around the potential of cooperative services, get carried away with their own rhetoric. Now, CQC, sorry, am I a pain? CQC, yeah, absolutely rightly, they've got outstanding, good, needs improvement, yeah, or what's the last one? Fail? Inadequate. Now I've said, what's the cooperative advantage in a social care cooperative? What's the cooperative advantage? Is it they all become good? Well, you could go to hundreds of private sector residential care homes and they're good. So what's the cooperative advantage? What I have said is if we're going to be ambitious around cooperatives and realise that within the context of safeguarding, in the context of multi-stakeholder, in the context of ownership, it has to be outstanding. It has to be outstanding. Because if it's not outstanding, how do you then demonstrate that the cooperative is of more value in terms of that relational change between user, worker, owner and commissioner? What's the benefit? So my ambition with CQC, that I love dearly, is that there will be over the next 10 years, I don't know how long CQC can survive, but it will survive in some shape or form, because they're always changing regulatory authorities. However, if in 20 years' time, and I'll probably be down at my local church cemetery, yeah, probably. I hope not, but I might be. I'd like to see social care, not just traditional social care, but a revolution in the nature and the practice of how we support people. Yeah? In 1969, when I first entered social care, social work, as a welfare assistant in Newham, we had daycare, home helps in those days, transferred and transformed into home care, day centres, home care, residential care, a little bit of visiting. That was the landscape. None of this personalisation stuff, none of this stuff around personal budgets. What's changed? The architecture of social care, what's changed? Why do we still think of social care in the context of the same sorts of stuff that I was dealing with in the late 1960s? It's 2017, is it? Yeah, 2017 for God's sake. It is 17, isn't it? 2017 for God's sake. Now, safeguarding, in my view and your view, is incredibly important. But what has been the impact of the Care Act? What has been the impact in your own environments, in your own services, when you're trying to safeguard? What are the drivers? And how is the individual or whoever who is at risk, who defines that risk? How are they in control? How do we stop thinking of safeguarding in the context of victims? How do we do that? Got about 3 minutes. Oh, okay. Let's sum up. We also need to locate social care cooperatives in the context of the role and requirements of regulation. And my chats with CQC and Anglia, just what I thought, throw that in, and Anglia, have been very promising. Because CQC is really serious in terms of looking at different models of care. Very serious about that. And they are interested in the possibilities and options around social care cooperatives. But as I say, certainly within the cooperative sector, don't in 20 years' time, when I'm lying in state at St Mary's Churchyard, don't think that what I'm after here is a whole range of residential care services, home care, phone lines, whatever, with just a cooperative mark, a brand. It's got to be meaningful, and it's got to fundamentally shift the relationship between providers, users, families and communities. I'm advancing cooperative approaches on the grounds that I've outlined. I'm excited by the possibilities, but I'm nervous. I'm nervous of capture. And already within the cooperative movement, there is a move away from the notion of multi-stakeholder, because multi-stakeholder has another problem. There's no legal foundation for it. But I believe that it does hold a real potential to revolutionise in the same way that a group in Rochdale in 1884 revolutionised retail. I really believe that. You've been very kind. Thank you very much.